When it comes to melee VR games, Blade and Sorcery and Hellsplit Arena are two of the best, so let's compare them. Both lean into physics. This means that both games have full collisions with pretty much everything. Your hands will collide with objects in the world, weapons will hit things rather than going through them, you can pick lots of things up and throw them around, and weapons will connect with each other. They also try to deal with weight, so when you pick up an heavy object or weapon, it doesn't feel weightless. Blade and Sorcery seems to be doing this with raw physics. So when you pick something up, it has a set amount of weight in the game world, and then your in-game character will be able to pick it up easily or struggle depending on how heavy the object is. The physics can be bouncy though, like when picking up this big barrel, it will bounce around in my hands even though I'm not actually moving them. This big hammer will bounce when you move your hand and then stop. It can feel a bit janky with heavy stuff, but it gets better the lighter you go. If you look at this sword for example, when I move my hand around one-handed, there's a delay with the movement, and if I move my hands really quickly, the sword seems to struggle to keep up, and it ends up flipping around uncontrollably. If you two-hand it, it feels much more one-to-one with my hand movements. Hellsplit Arena seems to have just gone with using a delay to your movements to simulate weight. Grabbing this big box feels like it has some weight, but it doesn't bounce around. If we look at the big hammer, it doesn't lang down as our in-game character struggles to hold it. It simply lags behind our hand movements, making the weapon feel heavy and sluggish, but if we grab it with both hands and move our hands quickly, now it swings much faster and with more power. This large sword feels lighter than the hammer, but still has large delay with hand movements. But you can see that no matter how fast I move my hands, the weapon keeps up with my movements and doesn't start to flail and act strange. They are different approaches and neither of them are perfect. Ideally, I would like something in between the two, but it's going to be down to personal preference. When it comes to using the weapons, Hellsplits are much more consistent and less janky, making the game feel more polished and leads to less frustration, so just from a gameplay standpoint I prefer Hellsplit's approach. The way you pick up and handle objects and weapons is slightly different as well. With Blade and Sorcery, you hold your arm out and you get an indicator on the object your hand is focused on. You press the grip, which makes the object fly into the air, and then you press the trigger to warp it into your hand. This works very well and feels very satisfying. Hellsplit Arena also lets you grab things from a distance, but objects just fly straight into your hand. They don't use any sort of indicator to let you know which objects you're going to grab, which makes it very inconsistent and pretty much useless. You're much better off walking over to the things that you want to pick up, and weapons will levitate into the air with the handle facing upwards when dropped. This is to make them easy to pick up, but shouldn't be needed if they implemented something like Blade and Sorcery's pickup system. When you're holding a weapon, you can adjust your grip in both games by pressing the trigger and sliding your hand up and down when gripping it. You can also grab the blade end of a sword with both games, but with Blade and Sorcery you don't have hand posers, so your hand looks janky and awkwardly grips it. With Hellsplit Arena you have hand posers, and you can also hold the trigger while holding the blade to slide your hand up and down, and your hands will do a little animation which you can't do in Blade and Sorcery. It's a nice touch, and again it gives Hellsplit Arena a more polished feel. Let's talk about actually using the weapons on enemies. We'll start with slashing attacks with Blade and Sorcery. The sword will make contact with the enemy and cause a slice decal to appear where you hit them, but a lot of the times the enemy will barely react. You've just caused a massive big open wound on their body and they don't really move or react other than screaming out in pain. Other times they will fall to the floor, and if you land a fatal blow they just drop. If we use a blunt weapon like a mace, it's much more satisfying. If you hit them in the head, they will either die pretty much instantly or fall down, allowing you to bludgeon them to death. Hellsplit Arena's enemies are much more reactive to your attacks. The footage is a little choppy for some reason. It was fine in the headset with good frame time, so maybe I had some CPU spikes. You can see that when I slash with the sword, the enemy will stagger back, and a fatal blow results in slitting his throat and he bleeds out. Here I go for the legs and he reacts and stumbles. I slice his leg off and he then crawls towards me. My horse comes over and has a big poo, and I stab the crawling enemy in the head. Using a mace again, the enemies react more. I can knock the guy around and to the floor. I deflect his sword attack, causing him to go into a stunned state. I give him a hit to the body to stagger him, then smash his head in, which causes it to explode in a gory mess. Both games do have Dismemberment, although Blade and Sorcery is much harder to do as standard. There are mods for Blade and Sorcery which make it easier and increase the gore, but standard for standard, I much prefer the way the enemies react in Hellsplit Arena, and the gore, the ability to chop off legs, arms and heads easier, makes the weapons feel much more powerful and satisfying to use in my opinion. What about stabbing enemies? That feels much more satisfying in Blade and Sorcery. As the blade goes in, it has resistance and it will stay stuck in the enemy. You can also grab onto the enemies to keep them still while you stab them in the head, although things can get very janky with them flying and flailing around. Hellsplit stabbing isn't as good. It's very easy to stab enemies, and sometimes it barely feels like you're even making contact and you end up killing them. The blades have very little resistance going in or out of the flesh, and overall, it's nowhere near as satisfying as Blade and Sorcery. You can also pick people up by the head for an easier stab, but Hellsplit's enemies have much more weight. You can't throw them or rag them around, and you experience much less jank. Some big differences between the two are Blade and Sorcery has magic and Hellsplit doesn't. As standard, you have 3 spells. Fire throws a fireball which you can control after thrown by moving your hand. Lightning is basically some Sith Lord Darkside shit, and the gravity spell is like a force push you can use to push enemies back or even boost yourself up into the air. You can also use the gravity spell to grab enemies and throw them around from a distance. Spells can also be used on weapons to give them extra powers. More spells are available through mods, and mods are a massive part of Blade and Sorcery and why it's so popular. There are so many, I can't list them all here, but they include new weapons like the Gravity Hammer from Halo, new spells, new levels, and complete packages like the Star Wars Outer Wilds pack, which includes weapons, enemies and locations from the Star Wars universe. Blade and Sorcery also has much more freedom in movement. You can climb, which has been drastically improved since the last time I played it. When you get to the top, now you can jump onto the ledge and even wall jump across the different ledges and grab points. You can swing across gaps and slow down time. The game has stealth built into some of the game modes, which I'll cover later, allowing you to sneak through areas undetected. There are zip lines that you can use with a pulley that you carry in your new inventory system. It all allows for a lot more creativity and diversity in what you can do and how you approach the game, giving the player complete freedom to do what they want, and allows for some really epic moments and footage which you can see from many YouTubers. Hellsplit Arena does have potions, which you can combine with weapons like fire and ice, so you can set enemies on fire or freeze them when you strike them. The game also has horses you can ride as you pass them, which is a lot of fun, but the levels are more restricted with mostly flat arenas and no climbing or a way to play stealth. Both games also have bow and arrows for ranged attacks, which work well. The AI in both games are not the strongest. They keep their distance just out of striking range, forcing you have to move in to attack. They will attack you with a few pre-scripted attack moves. One-on-one fights are very easy in either game, and the difficulty ramped up with more enemies to fight at once. Both have a few different enemy types. Some have shields, some have bow and arrows to attack from range. Blade and Sorcery enemies can perform magic, and both games have different levels of armour which make them harder to kill. Hellsplit Arena uses undead type enemies, so you can chop off arms and legs and they'll still try and fight you. They also have skeleton enemies, which I personally hate. So what is there to do in the games? Hellsplit Arena has 9 maps with a couple of alternatives like one in a blizzard or one at night. Blade and Sorcery has 5 maps by default and 1 procedural level generator which uses tiled sections which are randomly stitched together. Obviously you can add more maps to Blade and Sorcery with mods, but most aren't near the standard of the ones that come with the base game. I've already mentioned before that Hellsplit Arena's levels tend to feel very flat, whereas Blade and Sorcery has some small arenas but some larger levels on multi-levels, and the procedural levels are point to point, so you have a start and a finish, and you've got climbing, jumping over gaps, and generally it feels much more varied and allows for more creative gameplay. One big advantage that Hellsplit Arena has over Blade and Sorcery is a campaign where you go through levels, earn money to buy weapons, and the enemies get harder and more of them to fight, with an endpoint where you can finish the game. Blade and Sorcery has 5 maps which can only be played as sandbox or survival, where you fight off progressively harder waves until you die. The procedural dungeon is a separate thing you can play and configure the length and difficulty, but there is no unlocks, no progression or end goal that you work towards right now. There is something in the works called Crystal Hunt, which is a new progression system where you level up your character, buy stuff, explore dungeons while searching for crystal shards and loot. This is going to be coming out in 2023, although I'm not sure if this is going to be a grinding never-ending loop, or if there will be some sort of goal or end you're building towards. When it comes to graphics, there is no competition. Hellsplit Arena is leagues ahead of Blade & Sorcery with some of the better graphics available in a VR game. Some of the environments are truly stunning, like this big open area with a castle in the background, or this courtyard with rain coming down in a heavy thunderstorm. Blade & Sorcery doesn't look bad, although the human enemies look far worse than the actual environments, and that's after a big update improving them. Overall, they're both are games focused on melee in VR and lean on physics, but take different approaches both in the way that they handle weapons and the way the content is laid out in the game. Which game you choose will depend on your own personal playstyle and the type of gamer you are. If you want something with more advanced physics, that gives more freedom to do what you want, full mod support, but is a make your own fun sandbox type game, then Blade & Sorcery is the one for you. If you want something more polished, both visually and in its gameplay, something with a structured campaign you progress through, unlocking new levels, weapons and enemies with an endpoint where you can finish the game, then go for Hellsplit Arena. Hellsplit Arena is more restrictive though, and the campaign mode consists of going to new levels, fighting progressively harder waves of enemies. Ideally, I want something that mixes the best parts of both games and wraps it up in a story-driven single-player campaign with good pacing and not just constant fight after fight. Asgard's Wrath was a good full-length campaign, but the melee combat is lacking and the worst part of the game for me. The only other game on the horizon that seems to be scratching that itch is Undead Citadel, which seems to be using melee combat with physics close to Hellsplit Arena, great graphics and a story. Let me know which game you prefer, and if you think I've missed something in this video. If you have any other recommendations for melee focused VR games, let me know in the comments.